what if the most effective cure for your absolute deepest, most paralyzing phobia isn't like a pill you swallow,
Yeah.
but actually a pair of video goggles you put over your eyes?
All right.
Or, I mean, think about this. What if a single dose of a historically banned psychedelic compound could completely, rewire your brain and just cure your depression for over half a year?
I mean, it really sounds like science fiction.
Yeah, it does.
Because for a very long time, the psychiatric field has basically operated on this very slow, steady, and honestly, sometimes incredibly frustrating trajectory. But the reality we are looking at today is that those futuristic scenarios aren't, decades away. They are sitting in clinical trials right now.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are super thrilled to have you with us. If you've ever felt like the world of mental health and neurology is sort of stuck in the past, relying on the same daily pills and the exact same traditional therapies we've used for like 30 years, you are definitely going to want to pull up a chair for this one.
Yeah, the overarching theme here is disruption. We are looking at what is essentially a complete paradigm shift across several distinct pillars of, how we understand and treat the human mind.
Exactly. And to guide you through this, we have a really fascinating stack of sources in front of us. We are pulling critical insights from PharmaVoice. We're diving into trial data from Clinical Trials Arena, analyzing reports from Psychiatric Times, and looking at direct clinical presentations from the companies leading this charge.
Right.
And looking through all of this material, I mean, it all points to one massive, unavoidable realization. The way we treat the human mind is currently undergoing this radical, unprecedented transformation.
And that transformation isn't just about tweaking an old formula, right?
Right.
If it were just one new drug acting in a slightly different way, that would be standard industry news. But we are looking at actual revolutions in brain chemistry. We are seeing entirely new delivery methods for neuroactive chemicals. We are looking at the targeted starvation of stress hormones. And as you mentioned at the top, we're even seeing the integration of generative artificial intelligence into behavioral therapy.
It's wild. So the mission for this deep dive is to essentially guide you, our listener, through the absolute cutting edge of mental health and neurological treatments. We are going to explore everything from clinical psychedelics and highly targeted hormone blockers to AI-powered virtual reality exposure therapy.
Yeah.
By the time we are done today, you're going to understand the exact biological and technological mechanisms that are reshaping the future of brain health.
And the emphasis really needs to be on those mechanisms. We don't just want to, rattle off a bunch of trial statistics. We want to look under the hood. We want you to understand why these new treatments are working when the old ones failed and how they actually interact with your neurology.
Right. And frankly, why you should care about this is pretty simple. Mental health isn't some niche topic.
No, not at all.
Whether you yourself or a family member or like a friend has ever struggled with anxiety, depression, insomnia, postpartum challenges, or the really terrifying reality of cognitive decline.
Yeah.
The tools that will be available to you tomorrow are going to look absolutely nothing like the tools we had yesterday.
That is a very hopeful message, but getting these tools to the public is a really complex journey. And to understand where we are going, we need to start by looking at perhaps the most dramatic and certainly the most publicized shift in psychiatric chemistry right now.
Okay, lay it on us.
We are talking about the massive push to legitimize what we call classic psychedelics as mainstream FDA-approved medicine.
Man, this is a monumental pivot. I mean, for decades, we are talking about substances that have historically been locked behind the absolute strictest scheduling laws, right? Categorized as having zero medical value.
Right, Schedule 1.
Exactly. And now the pharmaceutical industry is trying to move them into these highly controlled, data-driven clinical settings to treat some of the most stubborn mental illnesses we know of. Let's dig into the reporting from PharmaVoice regarding a company called Compass Pathways.
Yeah, so Compass Pathways is basically one of the standard bearers in this space right now. They're developing a psilocybin-based drug candidate, which is known as Echo MP360.
Okay.
And they aren't just targeting general, mild depression. They are specifically aiming this at treatment-resistant depression, or TRD.
Let's pause right there because we throw the term treatment-resistant depression around a lot in medical news. What does that actually mean for the patient experiencing it on a daily basis?
It is an incredibly difficult and exhausting clinical designation. By definition, a patient with TRD is someone who has already run the gauntlet of standard pharmacological treatments.
Wow.
They have tried at least 2 different classes of standard antidepressants. That's typically SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SNRIs, which target both serotonin and norepinephrine.
And those standard drugs work on the premise of keeping more of those specific neurotransmitters floating around in the brain synapses, correct?
Broadly speaking, yes. The traditional theory was that depression is a chemical imbalance, right? Like a lack of serotonin.
Right.
So you take a daily pill to block the reuptake of serotonin, which effectively artificially boosts the levels. But for a massive percentage of the population, that simply doesn't work. The serotonin hypothesis doesn't capture the whole picture.
Yeah, I've heard that's being debated a lot lately.
Oh, heavily. So a TRD patient takes these pills every day for months, deals with the side effects, which, by the way, can include emotional blunting, weight changes, sexual dysfunction, and they get zero relief from their crushing depressive symptoms.
Which just brings an immense amount of despair. I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
So when Compass Pathways brings ADP 360 to the table, how does psilocybin actually change that paradigm? Like, what is the mechanism that makes it different from taking a daily SSRI?
It operates on a completely different neurological philosophy. Instead of just tweaking the daily levels of a neurotransmitter, classic psychedelics like psilocybin act on specific serotonin receptors, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor. But the profound effect is what it does to the brain's broader networks. It heavily suppresses what we call the default mode network.
The default mode network. Okay, I've heard this described as the brain's rigid conductor, or like the ego center.
That is a great way to visualize it. The default mode network is basically the system in your brain that is active when you are not focused on the outside world. It's your internal monologue, your daydreams, your sense of self.
Right, a voice in your head.
Exactly. And in a depressed patient, that network often becomes hyperactive and just rigidly stuck in negative ruminative loops. You know, thoughts like, I am worthless, things will never get better, I am a failure.
Yeah.
The brain literally wires itself into these deep, inescapable ruts.
So the psilocybin comes in and basically takes that rigid conductor offline for a few hours.
Yeah, it temporarily dissolves that rigid network. And while the default mode network is quieted down, the brain enters a state of hyperconnectivity. Regions of the brain that normally never speak to each other suddenly start communicating.
Oh.
This induces a massive state of neuroplasticity. The brain becomes flexible, totally malleable. The patient, who is often guided by a therapist during this, can suddenly step outside those rigid negative loops and view their trauma or their depression from an entirely new, objective angle.
Like a fresh snowfall over those deep, muddy ruts in the road. You suddenly have the opportunity to ski down a totally different path.
That's a perfect analogy. And that biological reset is exactly why the phase 3 data for CMP 360 is making such huge waves.
Well, let's look at that data because it is pretty staggering. According to the source, approximately 39% of patients treated with the CMP 360 drug experience a 25% or more improvement in their symptom severity on a standardized depression scale.
Right.
But here's the part that really stops me in my tracks. This drug continued to work over a 26-week period with just 1 or 2 doses.
Yeah, and that timeline completely shatters traditional daily psychiatry. You are talking about a pharmacological intervention that happens once, maybe twice, in a supervised clinical setting, and the therapeutic benefits just echo out for half a year.
6 months. That's insane.
Right. The brain learned a new pathway during that neuroplastic window, and it actually retained it. And crucially, the trial data showed it produced mostly mild to moderate side effects.
That longevity is wild to me. You aren't tied to a pill bottle every single morning. So given this data, Compass Pathways is clearly feeling pretty confident. The reporting indicates they are planning to submit a new drug application, an NDA, to the FDA between October and December of 2026.
But getting that NDA approved is really where the science hits the brick wall of reality. Because getting a psychedelic approved is not just a scientific hurdle, it is a massive bureaucratic, methodological, and highly political one.
Right. Let's lay out exactly what the Pharma Voice reporting says about this regulatory friction, because it's a highly polarized environment right now. According to the source, the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services are currently giving the pharmaceutical industry incredibly mixed signals.
Yeah, it is basically a tug of war at the highest levels of public health.
On one side, the reporting highlights that Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. and FDA head Dr. Marty McCurry are publicly very enthusiastic about these new options. Now, and we need to be very clear here, we are just impartially reporting what is in the text of the Pharma Voice article. We aren't endorsing any viewpoints or taking sides. We are just conveying the regulatory landscape as it was described. But the article notes that Kennedy even told Congress last summer that he believes this line of therapeutics has tremendous advantage in a clinical setting, and he explicitly stated he wants to see a psychedelic approved within a year.
And we are seeing that urgency reflected in how drug companies are positioning themselves, right? They hear that top-down enthusiasm and they want to move fast to capitalize on it. But that enthusiasm is not universally shared across all the regulatory bodies.
Right. On the other side of that enthusiasm, the Pharma Voice piece points out clear signs of reticence among more conservative regulatory officials who take a much stricter, more cautious view of the entire psychedelic drug class. And we actually saw that tension boil over into real-world consequences recently.
Yeah, the voucher situation.
Exactly. Just this past October, CMP 360 was abruptly removed from a list of sponsors chosen for a new voucher program. They were pulled off the list right before it was publicly announced.
And that is not a minor administrative hiccup either. In the pharmaceutical world, being on that voucher list would have accelerated their standard FDA review timeline by 10 to 12 months.
Wow.
Losing that voucher is a massive blow. Time is quite literally money for these companies, but more importantly, it is time that patients with treatment-resistant depression are sitting there waiting for a new option.
But the hesitancy from these regulators isn't purely political, is it? I mean, there are genuine methodological headaches when it comes to testing psychedelics.
Oh, absolutely. The methodology is arguably the biggest thorn in the side of this entire movement. The gold standard of medical research is the double-blind, placebo-controlled trial.
Right. The concept is simple. You give half the people the real drug and half the people a sugar pill, and neither the patients nor the doctors know who has what. This eliminates the placebo effect, which we know is incredibly powerful in psychiatric medicine.
But how do you blind a trial for a heavy psychedelic? The dissociative and hallucinogenic effects are immediately apparent.
I mean, trying to blind a trial for a psilocybin derivative is like trying to blind a trial for a roller coaster. You can put a blindfold on a patient all you want, but the second the drop happens, they absolutely know they are on the ride.
That is the perfect way to frame it, and it has plagued the industry for years. In an earlier trial, Compass Pathways faced a lot of heavy criticism from investors and scientists alike because the blinding issues really muddied the results.
Because if they know they didn't get the drug, they get upset.
Exactly. If a patient knows they got the placebo because the walls aren't breathing, their depression might actually worsen out of disappointment.
Right.
But if they know they got the drug, the placebo effect might artificially inflate their mood simply because they are excited that they got the active treatment.
So how do they solve the roller coaster problem for this recent phase 3 trial?
They deployed a really clever, though still highly debated, workaround. Instead of using a traditional inert placebo like a sugar pill, they used a very low dose of the psychedelic itself as the control arm.
So the control group still feels something. Maybe a slight change in perception, a little bit of physical sensation, which helps protect the integrity of the blinding because they think, well, okay, maybe I got the drug.
Right.
But it's not the full ego-dissolving therapeutic dose.
Precisely. It establishes a baseline of the drug's safety and biological activity while allowing the researchers to isolate the specific efficacy of the higher neuroplasticity-inducing dose. And they absolutely have to get this trial design flawless because the FDA is not playing around with sloppy data.
We just saw a brutal example of that, didn't we?
We did. In 2024, Lykos Therapeutics had an incredibly high-profile failure. The FDA outright rejected their MDMA-based drug for PTSD.
Oh, man.
And the FDA explicitly cited concerns over the trial design, including the blinding issues and how the psychotherapy component was standardized.
Even with those high-profile rejections and the loss of that accelerated voucher for Compass, the big players in pharma are not backing away. They are doubling down with massive capital. The source notes that AbbVie just dropped $1.2 billion to acquire a psychedelic depression candidate called Psilocin from Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals.
Right.
And Johnson & Johnson's Spravato, which is an esketamine-based depression treatment, which we should probably note is not a classic psychedelic, but a ketamine derivative, is an absolute blockbuster. It had a slow start, but it is climbing rapidly in adoption.
Yeah, and when you see $1.2 billion move across the table, it proves that the industry sees the underlying biological science as undeniably valid, even if the regulatory path is currently covered in thorns. But we do have to look at the broader clinical context here. We can't just operate on hype.
True, and the source brings in a really great voice of reason here. Dr. Ken Duckworth, the Chief Medical Officer at the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, pointed out that while there is an urgent need for these accessible treatments, we still don't fully know how a drug like Kebam P360 stacks up against the other heavy-hitter TRD interventions we already have.
This is a crucial point for anyone listening who is actually navigating TRD right now. Psilocybin isn't entering an empty arena. We have things like transcranial magnetic stimulation or TMS.
How does TMS work, for those unfamiliar?
TMS is a non-invasive procedure where a clinician uses magnetic fields to stimulate specific nerve cells in the brain that are underactive in depression. It is FDA approved, it has a solid track record, and it doesn't involve hallucinogenic trips.
Right.
And then there's the esketamine we just mentioned, which acts on glutamate receptors rather than serotonin, offering very rapid antidepressant effects.
So Dr. Duckworth is basically saying, yes, CMP 360 works better than a low-dose baseline, but does it work better or more safely than TMS or esketamine?
Exactly, and that leads to a critical point of analysis regarding the speed of all this. There is a very real concern among psychiatric experts that if this regulatory process is rushed by political enthusiasm, if we fast-track a psychedelic, push it into clinics, and then discover severe unforeseen complications post-market, perhaps triggering psychosis in vulnerable populations, it could be disastrous.
It would trigger a massive backlash.
It could undermine public confidence in this entire new category of neuroplastic drugs for decades. We could see a repeat of the 1970s backlash that shut down psychedelic research in the first place.
Yeah, we don't want that.
So the question we have to grapple with is, is the speed of innovation fueled by desperate patient need and billions of pharmaceutical dollars outpacing our ability to test these profoundly powerful compounds safely?
It is a terrifying tightrope walk. You have patients with PRD who are suffering immensely today, who might not survive waiting another 5 years for the FDA to demand perfect, unassailable data. Against that, you have regulators who have a sworn duty to protect public health on a macro scale.
But this whole conversation about psilocybin and psychedelics relies on one massive logistical assumption.
What's that?
It assumes that the patient has access to and the time for a highly monitored clinical setting.
Oh, right. That is the bottleneck. You don't just take a heroic dose of psilocybin at your desk on a Tuesday morning and keep typing emails.
No, definitely not.
It requires hours of supervision, often with 2 trained therapists in the room, blood pressure monitoring, and a dedicated test space.
It is an intensely clinical intervention, and frankly, a massive portion of populations simply cannot access that, whether due to geographic isolation, lack of insurance coverage for the therapy hours, or just the inability to take a day off work.
So, if psychedelics represent the intensely monitored clinical side of the mental health revolution, let's pivot to the exact opposite approach. Let's look at how the industry is trying to democratize access to radical neurological treatments by making them available and critically safe enough to take completely unmonitored at home.
This transition is vital. If we want to solve mental health at scale, we have to move beyond the clinic walls. The next major evolution is taking incredibly complex neurochemistry, stabilizing it, and formulating it into a simple oral pill.
And to explore how this is happening, we are looking at clinical trials arenas reporting on a company called Lipocine. They have a drug candidate designated as LPCN 1154. And we are specifically looking at this drug in the context of postpartum depression, or PPD.
Postpartum depression is a uniquely devastating and biologically complex condition. It is classified as a major depressive disorder, but its onset is specifically tied to the timeline of pregnancy or within the 4 weeks immediately after delivery.
Yeah.
And it is not a fleeting case of the baby blues. The severe symptoms can persist for up to 12 months postpartum.
I really want to ask you, the listener, to imagine the biological and psychological load of that scenario for a moment. You have a patient who is physically recovering from the trauma of childbirth. They are severely sleep deprived. They are tasked with keeping a fragile newborn alive.
Right.
And on top of all of that, their brain plummets into a severe, potentially life-threatening depressive disorder, often accompanied by intense anxiety and sometimes intrusive thoughts.
The traditional treatment models for severe PPD have historically been a logistical nightmare.
Let's talk about why. What is actually happening in the brain during PPD?
During pregnancy, a woman's body produces massive, unprecedented amounts of hormones, specifically estrogen, progesterone, and a neuroactive steroid hormone called allopregnanolone.
Allopregnanolone.
Yes, and allopregnanolone is fascinating. It interacts heavily with the GABA receptors in the brain.
GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid.
Yes. Think of GABA as the brake pedal for your nervous system. It promotes calmness, reduces anxiety, and helps you sleep. Allopregnanolone binds to these GABA receptors and essentially helps keep the brake pedal engaged during the massive physiological stress of pregnancy.
Okay, so the brain is basically flooded with this calming hormone for 9 months,
Yeah.
and then the baby is born.
And the placenta is delivered. The placenta was the factory producing all those hormones. So within hours, the levels of allopregnanolone drop off an absolute cliff.
Oh, wow.
The brain's GABA receptors suddenly lose their grip. The brake pedal slips. For many women, their nervous system goes into a terrifying freefall, leading to severe depression and anxiety.
So the medical goal is to replace that allopregnanolone to stabilize the brain.
Yes, the synthetic version of allopregnanolone is a drug called brexanolone, but historically administering brexanolone was incredibly difficult. It had to be given as a continuous intravenous infusion over 60 hours.
Wait, 60 hours? 2.5 days attached to an IV?
Yes, and it required hospital admission and continuous monitoring by healthcare providers because it carried a serious risk of excessive sedation or sudden unexpected loss of consciousness.
Going back to our patient, you have a mother with a newborn, severely depressed, and the cure requires her to leave her baby, check into a hospital for nearly 3 days, and be constantly monitored for passing out.
Exactly.
That isn't just a barrier to entry. For many, it is an impossible wall.
Which is why Lipocine's LPCN 1154 is such a massive leap forward. Transitioning from a 60-hour monitored IV infusion to LPCN 1154 is like moving from being hooked up to a tethered, room-sized life support machine to simply carrying a pocket-sized emergency brake. Lipocine has managed to formulate brexanolone into an oral pill.
That's huge. Let's look at the phase 3 trial data they just announced in the source. They completed enrollment and dosing for 90 women aged 15 and older who were suffering from severe PPD. They randomized them to receive either this new oral drug or a placebo.
And the most important takeaway from this phase 3 data isn't even just the efficacy, though hitting the clinical endpoints for depression relief is obviously paramount. It's the safety profile. This study was conducted entirely in an outpatient setting.
Meaning the women took the pill at home. No hospital bed, no 4V.
Exactly. That is a massive paradigm shift for this specific neurochemical. And the safety data validates the approach. They reported 0 cases of excessive sedation, 0 cases of loss of consciousness, and 0 drug-related serious adverse events.
That is incredible pharmacology. They managed to successfully pack the hormone stabilization power of a 60-hour IV drip into a daily pill that does not require medical monitoring by a healthcare provider.
Which is why Lipocine expects this trial data to firmly support a new drug application submission in 2026. The entire goal here is rapid relief from severe PTD in a convenient at-home format.
The convenience factor here cannot be overstated. When we talk about democratizing access, this is what it looks like. If a woman is dealing with severe PPD, she might be at a high risk for suicide.
Right.
In that scenario, rapid improvement isn't just a nice-to-have quality-of-life upgrade. It is a literal life-or-death necessity. The difference between having to organize multiple days of specialized childcare, secure transportation, and sit in a clinical ward under fluorescent lights versus simply waking up and safely taking a fast-acting oral pill in your own kitchen while your baby sleeps in the next room. It removes the massive friction between the patient and their survival.
It allows the healing process to integrate into the patient's life rather than forcing the patient to pause their life to go heal. And it is really fascinating that we are talking about manipulating hormones here, because while sex hormones and neurosteroids play a huge role in postpartum brain health, there is another hormone that is currently taking center stage in a completely different and arguably much larger area of neurology.
Right. We're moving from the sudden crash of sex hormones to the slow, toxic buildup of the ultimate stress hormone, cortisol. And looking at the research, it seems that controlling cortisol might actually be the master key to treating both debilitating depression and the tragedy of Alzheimer's disease.
Cortisol is one of the most misunderstood chemicals in our body. It is absolutely essential for life. It is our primary fight-or-flight hormone. It wakes us up in the morning, it regulates our metabolism, it reduces systemic inflammation, and it prepares our body to deal with immediate physical threats.
The classic evolutionary example. You see a tiger, your adrenal glands flood your system with cortisol, your heart rate spikes, glucose is dumped into your muscles, and you run for your life.
Exactly. It's a brilliant survival mechanism. The problem is the evolutionary mismatch of the modern world. We aren't running from tigers anymore, but our brains interpret a nasty email from a boss, a stressful news cycle, or crushing financial pressure as a tiger. So our bodies are constantly pumping out cortisol.
And when cortisol levels in the brain are chronically elevated, it stops being a helpful survival tool and becomes a neurotoxin.
Precisely. Chronic, high-level exposure to cortisol is highly toxic to nerve cells, particularly in areas like the hippocampus, which is critical for memory and emotion. It has long been proposed by neuroscientists as a pathogenic mechanism, meaning a root driving cause in both major depressive disorder and Alzheimer's disease.
The brain is essentially bathing in a toxic stress soup for years, which accelerates cognitive decline. So we have a corporate presentation from Actinogen Medical Limited. They are an ASX-listed biotechnology company, and they are developing an oral drug called Xanamem. The generic name is amestedastat. And the mechanism of action here is elegantly simple, yet incredibly complex to achieve.
Yeah, it is a highly targeted small molecule. Specifically, Xanamem is a tissue cortisol synthesis inhibitor. It is designed to block an integrin called 11-HSD1 inside the brain.
Okay, let's unpack this mechanism. Why are we creating a highly specific enzyme blocker? When I read this, it sounds to me like Actinogen is putting a bouncer at the brain's front door just to block cortisol from getting in.
That bouncer metaphor is actually a brilliant way to conceptualize the challenge, but we need to refine it slightly to show why Xanamem is so unique. Your body needs cortisol circulating in the bloodstream to survive.
Right.
If you just take a pill that stops your adrenal glands from making cortisol entirely, if you block it systemically across the whole body, you create a massive, dangerous physiological crisis.
Yeah, you would essentially induce adrenal insufficiency. Your blood pressure could crash, your blood sugar would plummet, you'd be in critical danger.
Right. You cannot just turn off the body's cortisol supply, so the bouncer can't stand at the adrenal glands. The genius of Xanamem is that it is uniquely brain penetrant. It slips seamlessly past the blood-brain barrier.
Blood-brain barrier being that highly selective security mesh that protects the brain from most circulating chemicals.
Exactly. Xanamem gets past that barrier, and once inside the brain tissue, it finds that specific enzyme, 11-HSD1. That enzyme's only job is to take inactive cortisone and locally convert it into active cortisol right there inside the brain. Xanamem binds to that enzyme and neutralizes it.
So the bouncer isn't stopping cortisol from circulating in the body's bloodstream. The bouncer is standing inside the brain, shutting down the local factory that is manufacturing the toxic excess.
Exactly. It lowers the brain cortisol to protect the delicate neurons while leaving the body's peripheral adrenal cortisol synthesis completely untouched and functioning normally.
That is an incredibly elegant pharmacological sniper shot. But does the bouncer ever accidentally tackle the wrong guy? Like, does it block other necessary hormones?
That is the beauty of the safety profile they're seeing. It is highly selective for just that one enzyme. And the clinical progress Actinogen is making strongly validates this entire theory. They have already run a phase 2A trial in patients with major depressive disorder, and the results showed clinically and statistically significant benefits across multiple endpoints.
So it works.
Yeah, starving the depressed brain of that excess cortisol actually works to reduce depressive symptoms.
But while MDD is a massive market, the real white whale they are hunting here is Alzheimer's. The source details that Actinogen is currently running a massive phase 2b3 trial called Xanamem, specifically for Alzheimer's disease.
And running an Alzheimer's trial is a colossal logistical undertaking. They have 35 active clinical sites spread across Australia and the US. They are expecting their 100th patient to enroll in Q2 of 2025. They have an interim analysis scheduled for late in 2025 and final results expected in late 2026.
What does an interim analysis mean in this context?
It's a planned checkpoint. Independent data reviewers look at the unblinded data halfway through the trial to ensure the drug is safe and to see if the efficacy signals are strong enough to justify continuing the massive expense of the trial.
We really need to contextualize for you, the listener, why an oral pill for Alzheimer's is so disruptive right now. If you followed Alzheimer's news over the last few years, the recent major breakthroughs have been a class of drugs called monoclonal antibodies, things like Leqembi or Aduhelm.
Monoclonal antibodies are essentially lab-made proteins designed to bind to specific targets in the body. In the case of Alzheimer's, they primarily target and help clear out amyloid plaques, which are sticky buildups of proteins in the brain that disrupt cell function.
But the administration of these antibodies is heavy. They are administered via intravenous infusion, meaning regular clinic visits. They are really only effective in early-stage disease. And most critically, they carry a known risk of a condition called ARIA, which involves brain swelling and microbleeding.
Because of that severe risk, patients on these antibody drugs require extensive, invasive, and expensive monitoring, like regular MRI scans, just to make sure their brain isn't actively bleeding.
The antibody route is undeniably a breakthrough for some early-stage patients, but it is intense, it is incredibly expensive, and it is logistically heavy for the healthcare system. Xanamem, on the other hand, targets a totally different mechanism. Instead of clearing plaques, it is starving the brain of toxic cortisol to slow the overall neurodegeneration.
And because of that mechanism, it can potentially target later-stage disease where antibodies fall short. It doesn't require that invasive MRI monitoring because it doesn't cause brain swelling. And it is a simple, once-daily pill.
The clinical and commercial advantages of that are staggering, especially when you consider that the Alzheimer's treatment market is projected to hit $20 billion by 2030. If Actinogen succeeds, they have a massive operational advantage.
And the safety profile backs up that commercial potential. Across their various trials, they've treated over 400 people with Xanamem, demonstrating excellent safety and a very low risk of drug-to-drug interactions.
That low interaction risk is key for elderly Alzheimer's patients who are often already taking half a dozen other medications for blood pressure, cholesterol, etc.
Exactly. It makes Xanamem an ideal candidate for combination therapy in the future. And from a business standpoint, the molecule is protected by robust composition of matter patents until 2031, with potential extensions reaching out to 2036.
I want to pause on the science for a second because learning about this cortisol mechanism raises an incredibly important, almost philosophical point.
Oh.
If Actinogen proves in these massive trials that we can physically slow neurodegeneration and alleviate severe depression simply by starving the brain of excess stress hormones, what does that say about the physical toll of our modern lifestyles?
It is a deeply sobering thought. As a society, we've essentially normalized chronic, unending stress. We wear it as a badge of honor. We have normalized being in a constant state of low-grade fight or flight because of our smartphones, the 24/7 news cycle, the demands of the modern workplace, and financial anxieties.
You're constantly telling our bodies that a tiger is in the room.
And Xanamem's underlying science suggests that this lifestyle isn't just making us feel anxious emotionally. It is actively, chemically bathing our physical brains in a neurotoxic hormone that accelerates our own cognitive decline and shrinks our memory centers. We have built an environment that is so toxic to our neurology that we are now having to invent highly targeted proprietary enzymatic molecules just to protect our brains from the daily lives we've created.
That is a heavy, heavy realization. We are medicating the symptom of a societal disease.
Yeah.
But it perfectly highlights the absolute interconnectedness of the mind and the body. You cannot separate brain chemistry from physical health.
Right.
And that brings us to the fourth major shift we are looking at today. Refining the toolkit we already have, specifically regarding the devastating physical side effects of psychiatric medicine.
Historically, psychiatric drugs are notorious for awful collateral damage. The brain and the body are deeply linked, but our drugs often treat them as separate. You might take a pill that successfully cures the mind, stops the panic attacks, or lifts the depression, but the physical side effects can be completely debilitating.
We are talking specifically about metabolic issues, massive rapid weight gain, shifting lipid profiles, and severe insulin resistance.
To explore how the pharmaceutical industry is trying to fix this glaring flaw in our current toolkit, we are looking at a Phase 3 trial that was recently presented at the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology's 64th annual meeting, which was detailed in a report from Psychiatric Times.
This trial is a head-to-head comparison. It looks at a new investigated drug called Seltorexant and compares it against a very established, widely used drug called Quetiapine Extended Release, or Quetiapine XR.
The target patient for this specific trial is highly defined, but unfortunately incredibly common in psychiatric clinics. They were looking at individuals between 18 and 74 years old who have major depressive disorder, who also suffer from prominent insomnia symptoms, and who have a baseline metabolic risk, meaning they're already overweight, obese, or have blood sugar issues.
And crucially, these are patients who have already tried one or two standard antidepressants without getting an adequate response, so they are still depressed and they can't sleep. We really have to highlight that insomnia isn't just a mild, annoying side effect of depression. It is a core driver. The data shows it affects about 2/3 of all MDD patients, and it actively exacerbates the depressive condition.
It creates a vicious cycle. The depression keeps you awake, and the sleep deprivation prevents the brain from performing the necessary cellular maintenance and emotional processing required to heal the depression. You cannot heal a brain that refuses to sleep.
So what do clinicians currently do when faced with this patient? If the standard antidepressant isn't working, and the patient is begging for sleep. How do they treat it?
Doctors will very frequently prescribe an atypical antipsychotic like reshaping completely off-label as an adjunctive therapy.
Meaning they add it on top of the antidepressant.
Exactly. Quetiapine has a heavy sedative effect, which knocks the patient out and helps them sleep, and it can also biochemically boost the effect of the primary antidepressant.
But the cost of that sleep is brutal.
It is. Quetiapine is infamous in the psychiatric community for causing terrible, rapid weight gain and absolutely wrecking a patient's metabolic profile.
Let me push back on this clinical strategy for a second, because from the outside, it sounds insane. If a patient comes into a clinic and they are already clinically obese or perhaps pre-diabetic, prescribing them a heavy antipsychotic that is known to wreck their insulin sensitivity just so they can get a few hours of sleep seems like a dangerous game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
You are suppressing one psychiatric symptom, but you are actively inducing a systemic physiological crisis that could kill them via heart disease or diabetes 10 years down the line.
That whack-a-mole analogy is exactly how many frustrated clinicians feel. They know the risks, but they have been severely limited by the tools available to them. When a suicidal depressed patient hasn't slept in 4 days, the immediate psychiatric crisis takes precedence over the long-term metabolic risk. You have to save the patient today. Seltorexant is attempting to offer clinicians a powerful tool without demanding that horrific metabolic trade-off.
So let's look at how seltorexant changes this dynamic. In this 26-week double-blind trial, the researchers tracked the depression response scores using the MADRS scale, which is a standard depression rating scale. But they didn't just look at the mind, they closely monitored the body. They tracked total body weight, fasting insulin, fasting glucose, and HOMA-IR scores.
Let's define those metrics for clarity because they are crucial. Fasting glucose is just the raw amount of sugar in your blood after you haven't eaten. Fasting insulin shows how much hormone your pancreas is pumping out to manage that sugar.
And what is HOMA-IR?
It stands for Homeostatic Model Assessment for Insulin Resistance. It's essentially a calculation derived from your glucose and insulin levels that tells us how hard your body is working to keep things balanced. A high HOMA-IR score means you are highly insulin resistant. Your cells are ignoring the insulin, so your pancreas is working overtime. It is the direct precursor to full-blown type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so they tracked all these metabolic metrics for half a year alongside the depression scores. The clinical results showed that both seltorexant and quetiapine XR had very similar efficacy in actually treating the depression. They both successfully lowered the MADR scores. The patients felt better mentally, but the metabolic profiles at the end of the 26 weeks were wildly different.
Day and night. Seltorexant showed significantly less total body weight change compared to the quetiapine group. In fact, the weight change with seltorexant was so minimal it was comparable to the mild, highly tolerated changes you see with standard long-term SSRI use.
But the real magic of this drug happened in the subgroup of patients who were already diabetic or clinically obese at the start of the trial. In that specific, highly vulnerable group, seltorexant didn't just prevent further weight gain. It actually showed a trend toward improving their insulin resistance and lowering their fasting insulin levels from their baseline.
Meanwhile, exactly as the clinicians feared, the quetiapine group's insulin resistance worsened significantly over the same period.
The source notes a very specific, nuanced data point here. Seltorexant improved the insulin resistance without significantly changing the fasting glucose or the HbA1c values. What is HbA1c and why does that matter?
HbA1c is a blood test that gives a 3-month average of your blood sugar levels. It's the gold standard for diagnosing diabetes. The fact that seltorexant lowered insulin resistance without artificially dropping the raw blood sugar numbers suggests a profound mechanism. It suggests the drug might be associated with a higher likelihood of genuinely improving the body's underlying cellular insulin sensitivity, rather than just acting like a diabetes drug that masks the raw blood sugar numbers.
That is incredible. And this vastly superior metabolic profile is exactly why seltorexant had far fewer treatment-emergent adverse events during the trial and a much higher trial completion rate than quetiapine.
Patients actually wanted to stay on the drug. They were getting the antidepressant and sleep benefits, but they weren't blowing up their waistlines, they weren't feeling lethargic from massive weight gain, and their blood panels weren't flashing warning signs.
If we connect this back to you, the listener, think about the holistic nature of healthcare. For decades, psychiatric patients have had to accept a truly awful, unspoken bargain with their doctors. We will give you a drug to stop your debilitating panic attacks or to lift your crushing depression. But the cost is that you are going to gain 40 pounds, your cholesterol is going to spike, and you are going to become pre-diabetic.
It is a cruel trade-off that often leads patients to simply stop taking their life-saving mental health medication because they can't stand what it is doing to their bodies.
True healing shouldn't mean fixing the mind while systematically breaking the body. This seltorexant trial represents a highly optimistic future, a future where doctors don't have to choose between a patient's mental health and their long-term metabolic health. It proves that we can design adjunct therapies that respect the entire physiological system.
It is a massive triumph of targeted pharmacology. We are getting smarter about how molecules interact with the whole body, not just the brain. But chemistry, as advanced and as targeted as it is becoming, isn't the only frontier we are exploring today. Sometimes, the most scalable, rapid, and effective way to change the physical wiring of the brain isn't with a molecule at all.
Which brings us to our final source, and perhaps the most purely futuristic element of this entire deep dive. We've explored the chemistry of psychedelics. We've explored democratizing pill delivery for postpartum depression. We've looked at enzymatic hormone blocking for Alzheimer's and metabolic tweaking for insomnia. But what if the ultimate cure for severe anxiety and phobias doesn't come in a pill bottle at all, but in a digital headset?
We are looking at a platform called OVRCOM. This is a digital health system that combines virtual reality exposure therapy, which is abbreviated as VRET, with generative artificial intelligence.
The platform is designed specifically to treat general anxiety, highly specific phobias, PTSD, and social anxiety. And the clinical results they are publishing aren't just incremental improvements, they are genuinely disruptive to the traditional therapy model.
Let's look at their data. According to the outcomes from the OVRCOM platform, patients using this VR system saw a massive 75% reduction in their symptom severity. Furthermore, they experienced a 60.7% shorter intervention time compared to traditional therapy methods, and they had a 32.1% faster return to their daily life and work functionality.
Faster, cheaper, and incredibly effective. To understand why putting on a VR headset works so profoundly well for a mental health condition, we have to look at the underlying psychology and biology of exposure therapy.
Exposure therapy is not a new concept. It has been the absolute gold standard first-line psychological treatment for specific phobias and PTSD for decades. The biological premise is based on fear extinction.
How does fear extinction work in the brain?
When you have a phobia, let's say of dogs, your brain's amygdala, which is the fear center, has miscategorized all dogs as a lethal threat. The moment you see a dog, the amygdala fires, cortisol floods your system, and you panic.
Right.
Exposure therapy aims to retrain that amygdala. You repeatedly and safely face the feared situation in a highly controlled manner. Over time, your brain realizes the lethal threat isn't real. The amygdala stops firing the panic response. The fear is extinguished.
It's essentially a high-tech flight simulator for your absolute worst fears.
Yeah.
You practice the emergency over and over until it's just routine.
That is exactly what it is. But while traditional in-person exposure therapy works beautifully in theory, it is incredibly difficult to scale in reality.
Think about the logistics. If you are a therapist treating a patient with aerophobia, the severe fear of flying, you can't easily, safely, or cheaply take that patient on a turbulent commercial flight every single week to practice their breathing exercises.
You can't. Or consider xenophobia, the fear of dogs. You can bring a dog into a therapist's office, but you cannot guarantee how a real biological dog will behave. If the dog barks unexpectedly, you might accidentally re-traumatize the patient and set their progress back by months. Traditional exposure is clunky, expensive, and sometimes unpredictable.
The OVRCOM platform covers an incredibly wide range of these phobias using real-world Ultra HD 360-degree digital environments. They have specialized modules for ornithophobia, which is the fear of birds, amatsophobia, the fear of driving, claustrophobia for enclosed spaces, aerophobia for flying, acrophobia for heights, entomophobia for insects, and musophobia for mice and rats.
Virtual reality solves the traditional scalability and safety problems instantly. In a VR headset, a clinician has absolute godlike control over the environment. They can perfectly dictate the intensity of the exposure, the pacing, and the exact scenario.
If the patient is afraid of spiders, the therapist can start with a tiny cartoonish spider 10 feet away in the digital room and slowly, over weeks, graduate to a photorealistic spider walking on a desk.
Exactly. It allows for consistent, high-quality, perfectly repeatable exposures. And decades of neurological research shows that the human brain processes high-fidelity VR as real enough. The amygdala triggers, the patient feels the anxiety, they practice their coping mechanisms, and the fear extinction occurs. The desensitization learned in the digital world translates directly to real-world biology. The brain physically stops firing the panic signals when they take the headset off and see a real spider.
But the OVRCom platform isn't just a fancy 360-degree video player. That technology has existed for a decade. What elevates this to the cutting edge is the integration of generative AI. How does the AI change the therapy?
This is where the platform becomes truly personalized. The generative AI is used to dynamically shape the patient's learning pathways. It doesn't just play a static video. It actively monitors how the patient is reacting, often through biometric feedback or self-reported anxiety scales during the module, and it adapts the therapy in real time.
So it is essentially acting as a digital co-therapist.
Yes. In exposure therapy, there is a concept called the therapeutic window. You need the patient to be anxious enough to trigger the fear response so they can learn to cope. But if they become too anxious, they panic, they rip the headset off, and they drop out of treatment entirely.
So if the AI senses that the simulated turbulence on the virtual airplane is pushing the patient's anxiety into the red zone, it can seamlessly, dynamically dial the turbulence back to a manageable level.
Precisely. It ensures the patient stays exactly in that therapeutic window, maximizing the healing while minimizing the risk of re-traumatization. It is highly personalized, adaptive pacing that even a human therapist might struggle to calculate in real time.
And it connects everyone involved in the care network. The platform features a dedicated clinician portal. The therapist doesn't even need to be in the same room. They can build the specific exposure hierarchies remotely, watch the session live on their computer screen as the client experiences it in the headset at home, and track all the biometric and progress data over time.
It is a complete reimagining of the therapeutic environment. You no longer need to travel to a sterile clinic to face your fears. The clinic, perfectly tailored by AI to your exact psychological profile and governed by your human therapist, comes directly to your living room.
And the economics of this are undeniable. The source notes that this platform is being rapidly deployed by major health plans to radically lower the costs of psychiatric care, by schools to help massive populations of students dealing with social anxiety, and by individuals sitting at home who otherwise would never have had access to an exposure therapy specialist.
It democratizes the gold standard of psychological care through digital hardware.
Okay, we have taken you on a massive journey today. Let's take a collective breath and recap the sheer amount of ground we have covered in this deep dive.
We started by looking at the intense regulatory hurdles and the incredibly promising, long-lasting neuroplastic data of COMP360, exploring how the industry is fighting to bring classic psilocybin into the mainstream for treatment-resistant depression.
Then we looked at how companies like Lipocine are solving the clinical bottleneck, democratizing access by packing the rapid relief power of a 60-hour 4V infusion for postpartum depression into a simple, safe, at-home oral pill.
From there, we explored the toxic effects of modern stress and how Actinogen Xanamem is aiming to literally slow Alzheimer's disease by deploying a highly specific chemical bouncer to starve the brain of toxic cortisol, all without harming the rest of the body.
We saw how seltorexin is protecting vulnerable, sleep-deprived patients from the metabolic nightmares of traditional psychiatric drugs, proving that we don't have to sacrifice the body to save the mind.
And finally, we looked at how digital hardware like VR, combined with generative AI, is perfectly scaling the gold standard of exposure therapy to cure phobias faster, cheaper, and safer than ever before.
If we pull all of these wildly different threads together, the psychedelics, the hormone, the metabolic tweaking, the digital goggles, it leaves us with a profound realization about exactly where the future of medicine is heading.
It does. We are simultaneously learning to rewrite the brain's software through highly immersive digital VR environments, while at the exact same time we are upgrading its biological hardware through incredibly targeted, neuroplastic, low side effect chemistry. It makes you wonder about the near future. Will the psychiatrist of tomorrow prescribe a customized daily cortisol-blocking molecule alongside a personalized AI-driven daily digital VR simulation? Could we reach a point where we are effectively curing mental illness completely, simultaneously attacking it from both the inside out with chemistry and the outside in with digital experience?
That is an incredible, hopeful thought to leave on. The murky, frustrating waters of mental health diagnosis and treatment that we have struggled through for decades, they are finally starting to clear. We're building the high-definition tools for the mind, piece by piece, molecule by molecule, pixel by pixel. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay insanely curious, keep exploring, and we will catch you next time.